Welcome everyone to Making the Familiar Strange. My name is Ali ZimmerMas and I'm Tri-Faith's Education and Program Associate. You might be used to seeing our Education Director, Jeremy, leading this program, but he has handed over the reins to me, so I'm very excited to be joining you as host for the first time of what I'm sure will be many. Just like Jeremy, my role will be to welcome you to this program, to remind you of how Making the Familiar Strange works, and to assist our special guests in whatever ways they prefer. So let me share our introduction slides for the program here. All right. So like I said, this is Making the Familiar Strange. We're very happy to have all of you here. Our goals for this program are to study Abrahamic stories together and to take on new perspectives by looking at familiar, or sometimes for certain people, less familiar stories with fresh eyes and new points of view. Today, we're going to hear Jason Rife's perspective on a story from the Hebrew Bible about the beginning of monarchy for the Israelite people. So be prepared to think about that story in new ways. And while you participate today, remember we have a few ground rules. So of course, as always, be respectful. As we look at this story, consider or reconsider what assumptions you might be bringing to the conversation. Make sure you speak from your own point of view rather than on behalf of a larger group of people. I know this is hard for a lot of us to say, well, as this kind of person, or on behalf of this group, this is what we think, but remember to use those I statements. And keep in mind that in looking at these nuanced stories, we're all trying to hear and consider a new perspective that might be different from our own perspective. And it's okay if we don't completely agree with it. So, like I mentioned very briefly, today we'll be hearing from Jason Rife's perspective on a story from the first book of Samuel in the Hebrew Bible. Jason is actually a familiar face around here since he interns right here at Tri-Faith. And he's also asked me to keep an eye on the chat for him. So please type up your questions as they occur to you, either during or after Jason's presentation about the story, and I'll help bring those to his attention. So timely questions will hopefully get asked right away. All right, Jason, I'm gonna hand things over to you to introduce yourself and dive into the story.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Rife. I am, as mentioned, I'm an intern at Tri-Faith. I'm also a graduate student at the University of Nebraska, and I am a military retiree. I spent 20 years in the Air Force. Prior to my Air Force service, I did spend some time in Yeshiva, in a Jewish seminary in Israel. And I did grow up in a mostly Orthodox Jewish environment. So that's kind of where my perspective is attached to, not necessarily 100% connected. I mean, 20 years in the military, you kind of become a lot more attuned to the idea of diversity in religion, whether it be within Judaism itself or within the world in general. So I've got a slightly different perspective than you might find from somebody sitting in a yeshiva right now because of that. And what I'd like you to think about a bit is Israel and is in government in general and monarchy in particular. There are a lot of people who kind of wonder why Israel doesn't have a government more biblically based. And so the section we're gonna go over is a bit about the beginnings of the king stage of Israel. Prior to this, the system was set up where, I mean, we're talking originally with Moses. So he had oversight over everything. And then he appointed judges to kind of delegate authority. And it became a system where you'd have a local judge and then a higher level judges until you went to the head judge, who was also, after Moses, was also the direct person that spoke to God. So that's kind of the system that we had before then. Exact details about day-to-day life, mayors, and that kind of government structure wasn't really a thing that was discussed. We don't really know too much about how those things were run. I kind of make a connection to Starfleet or the Federation in Star Trek, where people know that it's better than now, but we don't know exactly what the functionality is. And that's, I think, how a lot of people will see the pre-king government. And I'll send a link to everyone, and I can also post it on the screen if that would be good for you. So this is the link that I'm looking at. This is a translation. It's got Hebrew and English of the book of Samuel, the first book of Samuel, chapter 8, because this is when we get into the first longing for monarchy from the Israelites. So what happens here, yeah, put this on the screen for you as well. Excuse me for 1 second while I set that up. Okay, so this should be, let's see. So are you seeing now that screen that just has the Sepharia page? It should be 1 Samuel 8 with 2 in the Hebrew, and the beginning of it and the first one there in English.
Looks good.
So, okay, thank you. So what happens here is, obviously, people get old. And so he gets old, Samuel, who was the last of the judges, and he puts his sons into positions of being judges as well. And they weren't very good at it. There was some, it says they accepted bribes, they subverted justice. There was some corruption. A lesson that we can learn from this right away is nepotism invites corruption. This is something that you can see in politics of every kind throughout all of human history. So that's there. So the elders come. Again, we don't exactly know how people are, these are heads of families. We don't know how they get their different tiers of authority. We don't get into the details there. We just know that these are the people that are effectively in charge at the lower tiers. And they say, your sons, they're not doing so good. We want a king like the other nations. So they're looking around at the other nations of the world at the time, and they see kings, and they're like, we want to be like them. Let's do what they do. How bad can it be? Everyone else is doing it. And this, Samuel was displeased, and he says, when they say that, so he goes to God, and he's like, hey, they're asking for a king. I don't like this. You probably don't like it either. And God says, go ahead, we'll get him a king. And then, says, don't take it personally. When people want change in government, you shouldn't take it personally. And then we get into the warnings that God gives about a king that will rule over them. And these warnings are further down in verse 11. So we begin with the warnings, and then think about these. You could think about previous kings or empires you've heard of, previous governments that were not necessarily kings or empires you've heard of, and the kinds of things that have been done by governments throughout history. See how many of these you might have, see if you've heard this before, I guess, basically. So it talks about he'll have people make weapons for war. He'll need people to be pushed into programs to plow the fields. That's the first section there. He'll take your sons and appoint them. Oh, sorry, the first one was, he'll take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen. So they'll be out there. He'll take your kids and send them to war. So this is definitely a trend you see in every king ever, that first thing that they need to do to establish power is to get an army. And that army is going to be the youth, the younger males, the early adult males primarily. So that's what kings do. And it talks about taking daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. So while they may get the son, he may get the sons to do this, he's going to get the daughters to do this. Basically, your children will become workers for the country, whatever goals he has. Seizing choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves, give them to his courtiers. So continues on that the king is going to take all the nice stuff for the benefit of everyone. Take the country. I need these lands. I need to have these vineyards. We need to look strong and powerful to all the other countries. So you need to give me stuff so that I look good, even if I didn't have it to start with. I need it. I need a big castle. I need a big entourage. I need a fleet of cars to take me around. I need to have a private airline. I need to have my Air Force. I need to have all these things. He'll take part of your grain and your vintage, your wines, and give them to his, well, eunuchs and courtiers. Fortunately, modern history, we don't see too many eunuchs, but throughout the history of kings, eunuchs and courtiers are not an uncommon thing until relatively recently in history. This one, the next one, 16 here, talks about taking your slaves and putting them to work for him. Fortunately, in the modern era, there's not too much of that, just because you can't take slaves from people who don't have slaves. But the idea is still continues on the same path, that putting somebody, a single person, and giving them this power, they're going to take all of the resources that you have, as much as they feel they need. And you're not going to have any control over it. You're giving up your freedom to have control over your own lives. And finally here, it says that you shall become his slaves. We end up with the idea that for most of history, when you have a king, in order to maintain the nation, you all have to rally under the king. Even if you don't like what the king is doing, if you don't, then the country falls apart. So effectively, you are going to end up doing what that king wants to do, unless somebody more powerful forces them out to become the next king. So whoever's in charge is going to have the power and the authority to make you root for the home team, always. And the end of that, of course, is that people are going to come and say, we don't like this anymore. We don't want this. Please get us out of it. And the Lord will not answer you on that day, because this was God's warning, and God says, don't do this. The end of the section on the kings is that people say, you know what, we still want it. This follows into all the different stories of all the different kings throughout the next several books of the Bible, where you have some great battles, some adventures, and a lot of terrible things. Almost every king has an example of something very questionable at best, or something that would today be clearly seen as negative and evil that they did, at least one major one, several minor ones, throughout all the kings, making most of this section of the Bible a treatise on the dangers of giving somebody absolute power, or even just lifetime power. That's basically what we have in the text. We also have, besides the dangers, the fact that people really wanted this, and people wanted to be like everyone else. They wanted to have the ability to have this king, to have this system that they looked like everybody else. They wanted to be the same as the others. And in the past, we've seen kings in the Bible throughout even the early stories. They're not usually the heroes. I mean, the Pharaoh in Egypt isn't considered a hero. Most of the kings do some pretty horrible things to the Jewish people early on. And yet this is what they end up doing. And this is kind of a bit of a critique on society and all large groups of people. We want someone to be that absolute ruler. We have this desire, this hunger for it. And we end up in positions where our leadership is not what we're looking for. And sometimes even with positive goals. So I would say that a lot of these things, these warnings, don't necessarily apply strictly to monarchies. A lot of times you can have a dictatorial system of this level of control without an absolute monarch. And we are always striving to make things that we think are better by looking at other places. In recent history, you've got the revolutions that lead to purges, whether it be the revolution in Russia that created the USSR, whether it be the revolution in Iran that created the current regime. The previous regimes, in both cases, were not good. The people didn't like them for very legitimate reasons. And they revolted and they took over, leading to regimes that were different, but very much still repressive, still doing a lot of the things up here, still taking taking the children to fight the wars. So the question that was brought up is there an alternative? I see the questions here. So, and with normal transition, until this time for Israel, the transition was that another judge was appointed to be in charge and to make all the decisions that maintained the system of judges. The problem in this case about whether or not it was a normal transition is that the normal transition was to defer to God. This was the first system where they asked for a specific form of government outside of the structure of the judges. And unfortunately, it does seem that it may be a general warning about governments altogether. A lot of these things, like I said, not only apply to monarchies, but could apply to most forms of government at some level. You could even argue all forms of government do these things to a certain extent. And that the purpose of this warning is not only specifically that monarchy is bad, but that these are things that we should be watching out as individuals and as a society in all governments to see when they start happening, what we should do to mitigate or cut out these activities before they become too powerful. And I think that some of these are issues that created the American Revolution. Some of these things were happening here that we didn't like, and that we, in the 1770s, if you look back at some of the examples, obviously we were having people taken from our ships. Yeah. So yeah, they're not. This isn't a rejection of saying, well, like it says there, it's a rejection of the. It's a desire to be like everyone else, and that's how we end up with, this idea of going back to whatever everyone else is doing and creating the kings. But it is basically the end of a direct control of the people by God, and it's a warning of what you need to be watching out for as you go into the era of human, purely human rulers, without any connection to anything that's in that level of holiness, as God would be. So you have your societies that take from you, and we need to think about all these things. It doesn't talk about what people would willingly give to have a ruler. It talks about all the negative things, what's being taken. I think that it does kind of go into a time to think about. It says that, but what'll be taken by force. But when we create a government, when we look at governments in the world, we should look at what we are giving willingly and what we expect for that. There should be a up and back. This only talks about what's being taken. And a bad government, a bad monarch only takes and doesn't really give to the people and give back. It doesn't talk about a king that gives back. It doesn't talk about a king that builds. We have throughout history some examples of kings that have done some great works for their people. We have the story of Mansa Musa, who, as he traveled around with a massive amount of wealth and a massive retinue on his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, he spent ridiculous sums of money at every place that he went, so that the cities that he went through, when you have 60,000 people coming through a city, it's usually a lot of cleanup afterwards. It costs money and time. And his retinue, the way it was done is that they did what we always try to say to do, to make things nicer, leave things nicer than when you got there. And so that would be an example of a king that would be the other side, giving back. And you should be looking for people and for governments that when they step into a place, they leave it nicer than when they arrived. When the new mayor comes to the city, you want a mayor that at the end of their term, your city has more revenue, more resources, more stuff. And you don't feel as if, whether literally or metaphorically, they took your daughters, your sons, your land, and left you with nothing. So I think that this whole section is kind of a treatise on, again, like why monarchy in general is bad, but also why what we should expect and what we should see out of our governments, and we should be looking for as warning signs. Yeah, sorry, thank you, Ali, for the link. There are examples throughout history. That's just the first one that popped into my head, because it's pretty well known in world history circles, because he was deemed the richest human alive ever. So it comes up a lot. Obviously, with that particular amount of wealth and resources, we don't know 100% if he was always this generous. We only know what we see in the reports that came from around the region. There wasn't just his area. People in Europe were talking about his generosity. So, does anyone have any questions about this text and about the ideas of, or maybe some thoughts as to some examples of things that might be better given and better returned by governments, and maybe when it might make sense to do some of these things that are listed here in the warnings? Oh, I see Karen posted earlier, the systemic nepotism with monarchy. So that is definitely a valid concern. And it kind of is ironic that the issue they were having was this nepotism, and then they asked for a king, which is going to create a cycle of nepotism. So it does seem kind of, like complaining about the heat of the sand on the beach, so you step into water that's even hotter. And it's definitely an issue that happened here, where I guess with the kings, there wasn't so much a nepotism issue as much as an uprising issue, because that's the other half of the equation you have. Is not just the nepotism, it's the uprisings. Because when a king starts doing these things to the point where the people get upset, they want a new king, and that new king may not be related to the old king, but oftentimes by the time they get back into power, they might as well be, for all the intents and purposes of the change. So
we do have something in the chat from Bill Roberts, who says, what about verses 19 through 20? Sounds like the people had an unrealistic idea about a king's role to fight for them that had to be straightened out.
Yes, it talks about how a king should be at the head and fight battles. And I think that this particular idea of a king being out there to fight battles, to fight their battles, is something that we do see throughout history. You hear kings and generals being at the front of the battlefield. There's a lot of paintings and imagery like that. I don't know if that's always been the actual facts on the ground, but I guess when it comes to the wording here, it talks about our battles, and most kings, much like I discussed earlier, will fight their battles. And so, yes, it is somewhat of an unrealistic expectation to think that whatever you personally want the king to do, to fight for, is going to be what they fight for. So that is definitely another point to remember when it comes to different dictatorships and what the dictator is going to do, what the leader is going to do versus what you want them to do. And yes, I'm very sure that other kingdoms had some level of propaganda where you have to give this impression as a king that you are doing what your people want and that you are your people and that your people are you. You have to have that absolute control. And if you send that message out, and that's the message that a lot of these kingdoms may have been sending out, that they were unified in ways that humanity never really has been, that you may look at that and say, oh, I'd love to be in a place where everyone thought the same and did the same and function the same way and fought for the same things. An example of this, I was at the language school in Monterey, California, and there's a Hebrew language department. And they would talk to us. I wasn't in the Hebrew language department. I was associated with it because I'm Jewish. So they're like, you can come and help us with cultural things. So I would go down there. And I remember I was in one of the classrooms, and one of the students who'd been there for a few weeks was like, you know, and again, this is his words. I'm not, my opinions of this are not part of this. He says, all of us Christians have so many different ideas and different ways of doing stuff. It's so nice to see that all the Jews are all unified in such a way that they have one opinion and it's so monolithic. And obviously there's the old adage of 2 Jews and 3 opinions that I thought was kind of opportune moment to bring up. But also from the outside, we saw these kings, the Israelites saw these kings as having this like one unified thought process. And there are definitely indications that we see things on the outside that aren't there. We do see the grass is greener because we're looking at a whole field of grass. We're not looking at the fact that there's actually 20 different shades of green and a few shades of brown popped in there on the next field over. We just see from a distance, it looks like a unified green. And I think that this is why we, as humans, like things that are not what we do. We look at government systems that we don't have and say how great they are. Exactly, we don't see the manure that fertilizes the grass. We don't see how the sausage is made. We just see these nice, neat looking sausages from a distance. Oh, that looks delicious. But we don't realize that there's a process to that and that it's not necessarily what you think it is inside the sausage. And I think this is also an important thing to remember when it comes to building governments, is when you started with the whole idea of like other people, you started with the idea that these other people are all a monolith. And I think that this is also an important thing to remember today as we sit in the United States in 2021, that any group that we think of as a monolith, we're probably wrong about, because there never has been a monolithic group of people, a block of people, beyond very small groups. And even then, there's going to be arguments and disputes. So it is important to realize that if we have a government system that's supposed to be of exactly one mindset about everything all the time, then we're already wrong. We're already in this era of dictatorship, because there's disagreements. And there's factions, and there's people who have different ideas of how to do things, not necessarily opposite ideas, but just different, that we need to be taking into account. And when I first looked at this, because my idea was based off of the kings and how all the kings keep on doing things that are very questionable, that this was all a treatise against monarchy. When I went back to look at this, I did realize that a lot more than I may have wanted to admit initially, this is kind of a warning against all of our ways of doing things, that we should be paying more attention and seeing what is going on in societies around the world, and recognizing that there is a diversity of thought and a diversity of opinion that needs to be recognized and accepted and understood in every society, that oftentimes at least one level or another isn't. And it's a hard process. It's a hard concept to deal with as an individual and as a society and as a culture, to recognize that societies are a lot of individuals and a lot of cultures that have to not see each other as monoliths, as the others that are, the king like the others. That guy, he speaks for all of whatever group. This is a very important message, I think, for, I guess, the world, but also for the Tri-Faith Initiative here. I mean, we have 3 congregations among Tri-Faith, and oftentimes it may be easy to say that we have the Jewish thought process, the Christian thought process, the Muslim thought process. Yeah. And in reality, when you go to any service in any one of these buildings, you have a bunch of individuals with a bunch of individual thoughts and ideas that should be recognized and appreciated. We hear this, unfortunately, the very recent situation in Afghanistan. We hear a lot about, there's a lot of postings of people that talk about them, they did this, they did that, whichever they it is, whether it be us, England, Afghans as a single entity, and we're not paying attention to the thoughts that every single person in every single image coming from Afghanistan is an individual. And every single person has a different way of seeing the world and should not be piled into any they right now. And I know that that's, I don't want to get too deep into the conversation on that, because it is, for very obvious reasons, something that is going to cause a lot of contention. I just wanted to say that as soon as you're saying they, you should probably step back and step out of what you're saying. And kind of take a minute to look into what you're thinking of as a they, and is that they really an existing concept, or is it more of a individual or small group? Are there any more questions? Any questions? Sorry, there was, like I said, I'm at the university and there's a meeting going on soon, and some folks that had some stuff in the office. So if the noise level went up and down a bit, it's because they were grabbing a few things before they went to their meeting upstairs. So very briefly, we continue on. So there was the up and back of, Samuel gave all the warnings. People said they still wanted. Up and back a little bit, goes to God, and God says, okay, let's have a king. The process of of kingship. Again, the stories get into the various kings, and I don't know if you've heard some of the stories in a previous one of these sessions. We discussed a very disturbing story of David. So that's something to think about, is that we know even from the texts further on that this is bad, and we know from our own histories that this is a bad idea. Now, the message that I would say for today and these passages is to remind us to be paying attention to these kind of things when we see them in our society and in other societies, and as they come up, and to whether it be the direct statements in there, such as, how are we, if we started drafting people for war, if other countries are drafting soldiers or forcing people to fight or taking property, as well as the subtext, the idea that, are we starting to box in people into groups in unhelpful ways? Are we starting to see the world as blocks of ideas versus as individuals, as people that we should be caring about as individual humans? And yes, I think that in our democracy in the United States, we have 350 million people here. And it's very easy, especially when things get very polarized, to put people into blocks, to make everything very much binary: yes, no, good, bad, or good, evil, friend, enemy. And that we really need to spend, as individuals and as society and as groups, more effort in listening to people as individuals, and listening to ideas individually, and to think individually. Because not only is it easy to box other people into ideas, it's also easy for us to join in and not listen to what people are saying and just be part of a group. You find one thing you like about a group, you jump in, and the next thing you know, you find a king has one good idea, and you follow the king's good idea, and the next thing you know, there's 50 ideas that you haven't even looked at, that you are staunchly supporting and fighting with other people about, and you haven't even read them, because you're on a team and you have to stay on that team and you want to be a monolith. So it's not only how we push other people into monolithic groups, it's how we join up and become entrenched in the sense of the teamhood of like us and us versus them. We like being in us as individuals, but we really should remember that we're also individuals, and we can disagree on things with those that we agree with other things on. And that's okay, and should not be a reason to ostracize individuals or to allow ourselves to become separate. You'll see, we see a lot in our world where if you agree on one thing, say you agree on one specific goal, one specific right that you think should be the center of things today, and other people who agree with that join into a group, but they have other things that you don't really have that much information on, so you just sort of go with them, and eventually you find that you're in a group where the only thing that you agree on them with is that first thing. And we tend to have a hard time extracting ourselves from that and realizing that it's okay to, for especially with things that are actually opinions, to have different opinions. And we find a lot of things where things that we personally can't modify all that much, that we, instead of thinking about them deeply and having our own thoughts or opinions about them, we just glom on to the same folks that we agree with that one thing on way back in, months or years ago. So it's not just to not box people in that are the them, but to make sure that we're not boxing ourselves in as the us either. And I think both of those are important messages to remember from this idea. We shouldn't be doing things like everyone else, and we shouldn't be expecting exactly We should not be blindly following those like us, because in most ways, there is not even that much of an us. We tend to have, and when we find ourselves being an us, becoming a monolith, we should really start looking into what's going on, why that is. Because the us's, we're turning our own lawn into the illusion of being greener without really getting into the details. We're looking at the nice sausage on the outside, and we're not getting into the details of what's inside. So it definitely is an issue. Instead of having political parties with official positions, it's an issue, which it can be an issue of. It's an issue of having, and I mean, there's the opposite is a problem too, but having a two-party system where you have like everyone decides A or B, and there is no moderation. There's no, you have to be on a team. There's the people will come after you if you're not on a team, and that mindset is very much problematic. But yeah, I mean, like, I guess having official positions is somewhat necessary on some things. It's not necessarily needed for everything, because within a political party, there are multiple positions. There's a lot of different people. Again, you may agree on one thing, but not agree on something else. That shouldn't be, that shouldn't necessitate you leaving. And that's one of those arguments that I see a lot is if you don't like what the situation is, and whether it be in this party, in this conference, in this region of the country, that you should leave if you don't like it. That binary mindset of either you're with us or get out is more of an issue to me than official positions. But I mean, it is associated with official positions when they are on everything. We shouldn't be doing that. That's that it leads to this area where we now have extreme polarization. You can't disagree and stay in the group. And this is what kings do. If you disagree with the king, then either you're forced to stick with what the king's doing, or you're asked to leave, whether it be to leave the land or leave this realm of existence. That's the behavior of monarchy. That's one of the issues that monarchy has that we need to not be pushing in the society. And I think that kind of links again to this, the king fighting our, going out and fighting our battles. Is the king you have to agree with the king, and the king has to agree with you in order to fight all of your battles. There has to be that agreement. If you're not 100% on the same page, then the king isn't fighting all of the battles, because the king disagrees with you. Your leaders disagree with you because they're not 100% the same. So you can, and when you have them fighting all of your battles, then either you agree with them or you're the other. And that's why we need to have a lot more nuanced conversations. So I want to leave you with some thoughts. I mean, this is one small section that talks about specifically the downside of having a king, but there's a lot of different concepts here about government in general and about humanity and human nature that I think are pretty important to remember, whether it be at the ballot box or in casual conversations with friends and family, about the ideas that were mentioned, the ideas that power can lead to control and corruption in ways that we don't want it to. And that we need to be vigilant in our daily lives about the things that we do and what kind of control we are exerting over others, and whether or not we are exerting ourselves in ways that we shouldn't be, as much, which is equally as important, as an individual, what we do day to day, as what we do as a society, and what we do as a group of whatever size that we're in, whether we're the steering committee in our local organization. Are we seeing ourselves as a monolith? Are we seeing ourselves as a group that should have absolute control over, everything that's going on? Do we get to kick out the people we don't like of the club, of the housing association, the staff, of the school board? Is there room for people to be different that we're allowing to exist? Or are we letting one person, one king, rule over us and fight the battles? Yeah, exactly. It leaves open the option of what we should be doing, is leaving open the option to understand different viewpoints. And even if there's things that we disagree with, first of all, look for the things that we do agree with and try to work together on things that we do agree with. And secondly, to avoid ending up in a situation that we're so segmented that we end up with a king ruling over us, that we end up with these battles and this kingdom where we end up with a personality cult where this person gets to run roughshod over everyone else. And this happens, again, even at the small level. I'm sure that some of you have had, again, it's less housing associations. So if there's no other specific questions, I guess I will hand it over to Ali. And if you have anything else, Ali knows how to reach me if you have any other questions later on. And if you're listening to this as a recording and you have any questions, then obviously feel free to get a hold of TriFaith, and I will do what I can to find any answers that I don't know. And if it's just opinions, obviously I'll be more than happy to help.
Well, thank you, Jason, for a really interesting discussion of this passage and a really fresh take, I think, on this chapter of the first book of Samuel. If I know that we are getting close to the end of the hour, but if you don't mind, I have a question that I was curious about as you were talking, that I'm really curious about, like the whole group's thoughts, but we can start with you, Jason, if you would like to share some thoughts on it. What I think is really interesting is that this conversation kind of brings together religion and government in a context where we value at least having that separation of church and state. And so one thing that I was curious about in this conversation is a question for everybody. Would you say that your beliefs about government are religious beliefs or are religiously informed beliefs? Or do you like to see or try to identify a separation of church and state in yourself?
I can answer for me real quick if you want, and then I'll let someone else answer as well. For me, when it comes to government, I'm very much a strong proponent of the separation. Obviously, religious views of individuals, your culture and your society, if you are a religious person, that is part of your culture and society and part of your decision-making process. But I do think that using exclusively religion or assuming that your specific religious beliefs should be the standard for everyone can become very problematic very quickly. And so I think maybe this partially has to do with being part of a minority religion. And then maybe something that if you're in a more comfortable position where you know that if there's a question of religion, your religion will be on top of everyone else's for the answer. It might be easier to not be so concerned about the mixing of church and state. But for me, I'd like to keep them in general as a separate entity, with obviously with the mindset that the ideals of your religion, especially the positive ideals, should be part of your own decision processes when you make your votes in elections.
Thank you. Did anybody else have any thoughts related to that? Or anything else that Jason has said?
Hi, this is Carrie. I guess one of the things I worry about when people are really emphasizing religion in the voting process is that oftentimes it makes them into one issue voters. You look at one very, very specific thing that a candidate promotes or believes in, and then you forget everything else about the candidate.
Again, as I mentioned before about the polarization and the us or them, that definitely is an example of that. And I think it is very prevalent. I think that there should be, I think that for me personally, when I step into the voting booth, when I start reading about the candidates, I realize that there's going to be some compromises. There's going to be some things that like they may disagree with me on this, and so I have to realize that there are very few items that I would say for me are a make or break, and most of them are not specifically religion related. Fortunately, most of them don't tend to come up very often either, but I think that unless it's something very extreme, nothing should really be make or break. You have to kind of look at the whole picture of every individual. And I think that that would be the best idea. But then again, that's my opinion. And obviously I'm not everybody. And some people will go with a single issue that is their central import to them. I still think they should be looking at the other stuff too, because sometimes you'll see that single issue is so important and they ignore the fact that there's some other issues that weren't as prominent in the communication that are much more hazardous to their viewpoint that they're kind of letting slide.
Thank you. If nobody else has any thoughts, then we don't need to push this any further than it needs to go. But we would love for anybody and everybody who is watching to take our survey from today's program to give us some feedback, let us know how we can keep improving. And yeah, other than that, have a wonderful day. I'm sure that Jason would be happy to stay on for a few more minutes, at least until we reach 1 o'clock in case you wanted to follow up with him. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you very much, Jason, for leading us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Jason.